series on, yes, final Zoom series on intro to beekeeping and getting things ready. We talked about splits. We've talked about best survival tips from experts. And now we're going to talk about swarming amongst other things. So Erin, I will turn it over to you and I will get very quiet, I promise.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good. Just checking. Sometimes my audio is a little weird and I have a tendency to kind of yell at the computer like it's a TV. And so I apologize if I'm too loud or too quiet. Somebody raise their hand and say something. I'm going to just try to share my screen now. Let's see if we can get this into presenter mode. Are you seeing my screen now? Okay, so I'm going to talk about swarming today. It sounds like you guys have a fantastic program, and I'm really excited that that you're putting this together. It sounds like you've got you've had some good Zooms about good early management, and hopefully this will kind of round that out with the whole swarming discussion. So I always start by talking a little bit about my operation. When I listen to people talk about beekeeping, I always want to know, like, what is the context of their operation so that I can say to myself, is this, you know, can I translate this to me? Is this somebody who's running 7,000 hives and therefore is managing their bees from a, you know, from a forklift? Or is this someone who's, you know, only got 4 colonies and therefore has, and doesn't have a straight job and therefore has all the time in the world, and so they do all kinds of extra management. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about my operation, and then we'll move into the swarming discussion. So I do officially have a farming business called Overland Honey. I have a website that has almost nothing on it because I don't have time to maintain it, and I do have a Facebook page where I occasionally post things like where I'm going to be speaking, but I don't have a great social media presence or a lot on the internet because frankly, I just don't have time. And so I certified as an EAS master beekeeper in 2009. I run around 50 colonies as a side gig to my straight job as an accountant. I do a lot of queen rearing and overwintering of nukes. That's kind of my first introduction to beekeeping. The very first time I was ever in a meeting in a room with other beekeepers was the MSBA meeting. I think it was in 2007, where Michael Palmer was the speaker. And so for my very first interaction with other beekeepers, he was talking about queen rearing and raising nukes. And I went home and told my husband, I need you to make me a divided nuke body. And that was the beginning of a long journey. So as I said, in my straight job, I actually am an accountant. I'm the director of finance at Maine Audubon. And so my beekeeping is very much tucked into the sides and edges of my days and my weeks. So running 50 colonies as kind of a side gig I have a tendency to be fairly efficient with my decision making. And I have a pretty tight schedule often. But the good news is that since the pandemic, I get to work at home. And so I do get to sneak out and do things like check on the bees during the day sometimes. One other thing that's really important to talk about when you're talking about basic beekeeping management is a lot of your choices are determined whether or not you have the resources that you need. Like if you have extra boxes to put the bees in, if you have drawn comb versus foundation, you know, do you have nuke boxes? Do you have a variety of different sizes of things? Are you restricted because you've only got 3 colonies? And so I will preface this by saying I used to run a whole lot more bees than I do now. And so I have infinite amounts of equipment. This is my beekeeping barn. And that makes it really easier to be a beekeeper when you literally have absolutely everything you need then it's down to a matter of simple skill, you know what I mean? And you're not trying to work with one hand tied behind your back. And so I just want to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm talking about might be more difficult for people who are just starting out or just have foundation, but we'll talk about the specifics of that when we get there. So this is my little bee barn. It was built by the folks over at Midcoast Conservancy. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Hidden Valley Nature Center down in Jefferson, but they, one of the ways they raise money is they cut and build these timber frame barns. And so I had that awesome beekeeper. I mean, that awesome storage space. So, you know, one of the things that really drives me crazy when people talk about beekeeping is this kind of like, ask 10 beekeepers a question and you're going to get 12 answers. But that doesn't mean that all the answers are right, you know, and frankly, a lot of what you read on the internet or look at might be right in some context. It might be the right decision. It might be the right management technique for somebody in the South, and it doesn't really translate here. It might be just flat out stupid. And so I really encourage you to kind of think critically about the things that you are learning, particularly on the internet. And so getting together with people in your bee club, getting a local mentor, just working with other people around you, and, you know, being a member of the MSBA is a wonderful way to learn the right techniques for what you need to do here in our climate. So with that, I'm going to start talking about swarming. And this is something that this slide is something that I went through this entire presentation on artificial swarming down in Rhode Island about a month and a half ago. And after I'm talking about making the artificial swarm split and all this stuff, finally at the end, this woman raised her hand and she was like, does this mean that I'm going to be making more beehives every single year? And I kind of blinked and I'm like, yes, if your bees are healthy, they are going to be reproducing. And so this is something that most people don't really tell beginner beekeepers right often. It's probably a huge mistake that we don't, because people think you buy a puppy, you're only going to have one puppy. It doesn't matter how healthy it is. It's going to stay one puppy unless you deliberately try to, you know, hook that up. Same thing with chickens. You get chickens, you can pretty much count on the fact that you're going to just have 6 chickens. Very easy to control the number of chickens. Beehives, it is completely unrealistic to think that you are going to 100% control the number of beehives you have. It's a flexible number. Hopefully it doesn't go down as often as it goes up, but the reality is your managed honeybees are unregulated in their reproductive instincts, and they are in fact going to want to swarm. And the kind of, you know, old school 1950s, you know, I'm a farmer with my thumb on the hand of the environment attitude of like swarming can be controlled 100% is just flat out false. It's not going to happen. And so you can manage this reproductive instinct. You can work with this reproductive instinct. You can adapt to the reproductive instinct. You can even manipulate its timing. But to actually think that you can just somehow wish swarms away is false. So it's better to actually learn what you're doing, you know. And so here are beginning adorable brand new beekeepers. These 2 people were in the very first bee school class that I taught. They are both now master beekeepers down in York County, but these were their first 2 hives. And the look of joy and absolute innocence on their face is so reminiscent of, you know, the first time you get your packages. But then basically it's a second instinct is to start freaking out and worrying about swarming. So what I want to do is kind of just ratchet that pressure down and start talking about swarming as a normal behavior of honeybees that we as beekeepers are going to use and work with. So typical reproductive swarm. This is just me grabbing a swarm in a beekeeper's, let me just make my phone stop being bunging. I'm so sorry, that's going crazy. Throwing a bee swarm into a nice clean hive. So the basics of swarming. is that we're talking about colony level reproduction. The old queen leaves with the first swarm, the prime swarm, it's often called. And then the parent colony, meaning the colony that the swarm has left, then gets a new queen in the process of the complete swarming process. And so the queen in the swarm is the already mated queen that was in the hive before. And the new baby queen emerges and then needs to mate and come back and leads the colony. And that's a really important thing to understand, is that this is the superorganism level input of genetics into the colony. When the new virgins mate, they mate with different drones than their mother did, than their sisters are raised with. And so this is the colony basically adapting and changing its own genetics, and often improving, or in theory at least improving, because swarming happens early in the season. And so in theory, absent the human beings who are changing the situation, the new baby queens would be mating with the drones of other colonies that had survived the winter. And that's a pretty important understanding distinction, particularly up here in the north, where, you know, only the colonies that survived the winter would have drones to mate with under normal circumstances. Of course, beekeepers are importing bees from the south all the time, but we'll set that aside because the bees don't actually know about that part. So this is the beginning of swarming season. This is a picture of that right here. The first eggs and larvae being laid in a colony in the spring. Like, as from that moment, the colony is at the superorganism is at some level considering reproduction. And so lots of times people will say, I just, you know, I don't understand why my bees swarmed. I just put a honey super on last weekend and now it's Thursday and my bees swarmed. Like, there's plenty of space in there. And the reality is they had been starting this swarming process probably 30 or so days before this swarm actually issues. And so if you just put space on, you know, a week before the swarm actually issues, it's too late. Like, we're too far down the road. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the road and how the road starts. So I heard somebody say something about putting honey supers on and starting to split, which we love spring here in Maine, and we understand that the summer is super short, but I don't recommend that anybody do any major beekeeping manipulations until full dandelion bloom. And the reason for that is full dandelion is like the ecological trigger for infinite amount of food available to the bees. Even though we had a pretty decent, 70-degree stretch, I don't know what, 8 or 9 days ago down here in Portland, where we had some bloom. Now that things are cold, they're shut right back up. And so it's not until full dandelion that you want to really be thinking about splitting or doing artificial swarm management. But that is coming right around the corner where we all live. So back to talking about this swarming process. So after the swarm has left the parent colony, those new baby queens emerge. There are often many new baby queens for a variety of reasons, but bees hedge their bets pretty heavily with swarming. And then you can have after swarms, which are secondary swarms, which are issued with one or multiple of the new virgins in the little swarm, and then also a virgin remaining back in the parent. And the after swarms have even one more kind of tricky step that they have to go through. So not only do they have to do the whole house hunting process, but they also then have to successfully mate and make it back. And that can be tricky. But once the new queen returns to the parent colony, the colony will be queen right 2 or so weeks after the swarm has issued. And this is another really important thing to think about, because lots of people, when they miss their swarm or they catch their swarm, even if they catch it, they are very premature in looking for the new mated queen back in the parent. And people will often panic and run out and go buy a new baby queen, or go buy a new mated queen. They put the queen in the cage into a colony that is already in love with the virgin that they have. And then the colony then proceeds to kill the mated queen. And then the new queen does or does not actually survive the process of mating. And so then they actually do need to buy a new queen. It's that can be very difficult for beekeepers to negotiate, to like do this waiting for 2 or more weeks after the swarm has issued. And so what I always suggest is there is absolutely no problem with adding a frame of brood from a healthy colony to just see if you want to manipulate the parent colony and make sure that they don't go queenless, you can just continue adding brood over the course of the couple of weeks until the virgin emerges back and is laying. And you will know if she's not laying, if she doesn't make it back, because they will start rearing queen cells on the frame of brood that you add. And if they don't start rearing queen cells on the frame of brood that you add, they have still a virgin who is at some stage of mating, which we'll talk about in a second. So just picture of colonies looking like they're about to swarm. Lots of bees in the air. Many people panic at this time of year, the first few warm days, and there's lots and lots of flying around, lots of bees orienting, and think, oh my gosh, my bees are swarming. But I typically like to say that here in Portland, the first day of swarming season is May 17th. And so we're a couple of weeks away here. I would imagine you guys are even a little later, just because it's a little tiny bit warmer down here. So again, this cute, adorable swarms, baby superorganism. This is the new colony that we are thinking about, housing and capturing, but it's the new colony, yet with the old mated queen. So we have a couple of different types of swarms. There's the reproductive swarms, the primary and the after swarms, which is what I just discussed. And then overcrowding swarms are kind of a different story. And that's not really what we're talking about in terms of congestion. One of the primary causes of overcrowded swarming would be, you see that a lot when people are trying to produce cut comb, when they're, you kind of densely pack the colony so that you can try to get them to draw that thin foundation. Or you see it in mating nukes often, if they get ahead of you, but we're really talking about reproductive swarms. So again, the goal is superorganism level reproduction, and the whole process takes quite a bit of time. And so we want to start thinking about the early 30 days, 20 days. So right now, I just said May 17th is the first day of swarming season, right? And today's the 3rd. So we are 14 days away, which means that if in fact it's going to be May 17th, they probably are starting to feed baby queen cells right now in my colonies here. If in fact that's going to be the deadline for today, for this week. I would say, given the fact that we've had all this terrible rain, and even though it was warm, the food really wasn't reliable, that may actually delay swarming season here, because at least from what I'm seeing, I think my colonies are pulling back a little bit in their brood rearing because they're concerned about nutritional stress. I say that because I have an observation hive in my living room that I pay a lot of attention to. Also out in the yard, I haven't been heavily manipulating my colonies. As I said, the weather has been crappy and I'm stuck on the weekends. But it may be a little later. But again, even if it is a little later, they will probably be starting the swarming process this weekend when it gets sunny and food is super abundant. And so let's talk about what we can do, what it is what manipulations are that actually promote swarming. So one of the manipulations that promote swarming is to actually not manipulate. It's to leave colonies in the same size cavity, which is of course the natural situation that honeybees live in. Trees don't change their cavity size frequently, or most cavities don't, other types of cavities don't really change size. And that's part of the kind of swarming instincts that the bees work with. So changing the cavity size makes a big difference because it kind of messes with their signaling, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. Adding foundation to the colony as space, like when you are trying to give your colony more space to grow, foundation isn't really space for them. It's what I like to call nothingness. So when you have all these bees, like in this picture, looking for a place to go, just foundation doesn't have anywhere for them to store food or make babies, right? I mean, it's kind of like an empty, if you imagine if somebody gave you a house and it had nothing on the inside except the exterior of the house, that's not really a house, right? That's basically what foundation is. But if you have a house that's divided up into rooms and has staircases and furniture, that is living space. And so drawn comb is space. Foundation is nothingness that needs to get built out that will then become space. And so this is what I'm talking about when we're saying, having all the right equipment makes life a lot easier. But so to delay swarming tactics, you can add empty or nearly empty drawn comb right around the brood nest, because the congestion that is caused, one of the primary triggers of the swarming instinct is the congestion around the brood nest that prevents the queen from laying eggs, and therefore she loses weight. And so getting more space. And the way that they prevent her from doing that is all this incoming food that we're getting from the early spring, right? And so they're barreling in all this nectar and pollen, filling up the brood area with food. And what you're doing is now inserting empty space that the queen then can lay in. And I mean, they're still going to fill it with food, but that's a great way of delaying swarming. So adding more boxes to the hive, and even more deliberately putting those frames of empty drawn comb right around the brood area so she can expand into them. You can basically kind of slow the colony's progress down. Adding more space for the house bees to move nectar out of the brood area, like adding drawn honey supers, is a second different move. So you can do both of those moves at the same time. You can add brood space around the brood area, and you can add honey supers. And when I'm really trying to beef colonies up, like when I'm thinking about splitting, I'm going to talk to the person who is thinking about splitting right now. When I'm thinking about splitting in my own colonies, what I like to do is I like to get them super big and then split. So rather than splitting a 2 deep box and taking, let's say, a 5-frame nuke out of a 2 deep box, my first manipulation will be I take my 2 deep boxes, I separate them. I get another deep of empty drawn comb. I'll go in the bottom deep box, get 2 frames of actual brood out, put them in my new empty box, push the rest of the brood down in the bottom back together, putting the empty space on the side. So now I've got that. Then I put my new deep box above, which is empty, 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 2 frames of brood right in the middle, and then empty, 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 empty. And I put the other box of brood and everything on the top, right? So now I used to have a brood nest that was like a sphere, right? Because brood nests tend to be spheres. And I've just turned that sphere into an hourglass because I didn't separate them by just putting a big empty box in the middle, because that would be bad. I want connection in the brood area. But what I've done is I've turned it into this hourglass figure, which is irresistible to the nurse bees to clean that out. And then the queen starts laying there. So now I've just 50% increased the amount of brood space that I have, totally slowed down the swarming instincts because they're not crowded anymore. She's going to keep laying like mad because she's getting ready to swarm, right? And what they want to do is overpopulate. And so then when I want to do my split, I just take one of the 3 boxes away. It doesn't even matter which one. Just pick it, boom. And it's much stronger, and I also slowed down the swarming. So anyway, delaying swarming tactics, using both brood comb and empty honey supers will really help slow that congestion down. That's delaying, though. All we did in those in this whole blah blah discussion is slowed it down. But to actually prevent swarming, we need to be more manipulative. And so what we need to do to actually prevent the swarming is interrupt their ability to do that, and then reduce or eliminate all the queen cells except one to eliminate the after swarms. And then we can add drawn comb to allow the colony to move nectar out of the brood area. But so basically we're going to do all three of these things. So this is a really important component, or understanding component of beekeeping that all beekeepers should know, is there's three components of the swarming colony. There's the queen is one of the players. The brood and house bees are a third or second player, and then the field force is a third player. And if you remove any one of these three components, the swarm cannot issue. And so let's talk about how you would do that. So if a colony is about to swarm, they're going to swarm tomorrow morning, or in 5 minutes. If you get into that colony and catch and cage the queen and take her away, they can't swarm because they don't have any queen to lead the swarm, right? Does that make sense? I hope. I can't see you guys' faces, so I'm going to nod at myself. Another thing you could do if you absolutely wanted to stop a swarm, if you had a colony that was about to swarm, if you went into that colony and literally took out all of the brood, just literally take every frame with brood out of the colony, replace it with drawn comb, and put that brood into another colony or do something else with it, they won't swarm. Doesn't matter if you leave the queen there, the brood and the house bees are, if the brood is gone, they will change their mind and not go. And then the third thing that you could do is you can literally remove the field force. And the way to remove the field force is to move your colony away from where they are. We all know if you move your bees out, within the yard, the field force will go back to wherever they were. And the rest of the colony is now, 15 feet away, and they're disconnected. Now, of course, you would want to send your field force into another colony. So you could if you have a super strong colony that you are trying to manipulate to prevent swarming, and you're unable to find the queen because you can't find her, it's overcrowded, looking. You're like, I know they're going to swarm tomorrow. My mother-in-law is going to murder me because we're supposed to be having this big picnic, blah, 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 blah. I can't have a bee swarm in the middle of this thing. What you could do is you can switch locations with a weaker colony. And so now you've sent the field force out of your big, strong colony over to the other one. And that gives you a chance to then move along and prevent the swarm. Are these things making sense? I hope. If they're not, yell, just unmute yourself and talk, because there's few enough of us here that we can actually interact. So talking about that period of time before the swarm issues, when things are basically how the superorganism is preparing to do this reproductive behavior. It starts, like I said, with the first laying of eggs and feeding of larvae in the winter. Like when the queen resumes laying, that's the very baby first step. The second step that's much closer to the swarming is raising drones. When you start seeing capped and emerged drones in your colony, then they are getting ready to swarm. Bees will not swarm when drones aren't available, because the baby virgins wouldn't have anyone to mate with, right? And even though they're not mating with the drones in their own colony, essentially colonies that are preparing to swarm raise drones for other colonies to mate with, and I can only assume, that the other ones hopefully are out there doing the same thing. And so capped drones are a much bigger indicator of early swarm preparations than than many other things like crowding or like food availability. And so again, like I said, my observation hive here in my living room has no cap drones in it at all at this stage. All they're still rearing is workers. So, which leads me to believe that this nutritional stress, they're slowing down their growth this year because they're worried about food. And so once the food becomes available, meaning once the weather gets better, they will then kick into the next phase of getting closer to rearing queens and making swarm ideas. So the population increases during the process of all of this baby rearing. And then the queen pheromone gets diluted. And this is something that's another really important concept to understand is what is queen pheromone and how does that play a role in queen rearing in a queen right colony. And so the nutshell way that I like to describe this is that queens are secreting a pheromone that is a physical thing that can only be sensed by physical contact with it. And so I like to describe it that it's like they're secreting playing cards, like secreting Red Sox cards, right? And so if you're secreting a certain number of cards every day, this is your queen pheromone. And the bees, the retinue, the ones who are always touching the queen and feeling her, are basically picking off these cards, right? And then they go around sharing it with the other workers in the colony, which is how they know that they're all the same colony. This is how bees understand when the robbers are coming, that they don't have the right playing card or you know, whatever card. So if the queen is producing, and these playing cards evaporate after an hour, right? So, but there's only a certain number that she's producing. And as each individual worker interacts with another worker, like they basically say, hi, how are you? And do you have any queen pheromone? And the one says yes, that's closer to the queen, and she'll just rip it in half and give it to the other one. And so now everybody's got two halves of a queen pheromone, right? And then they meet someone else and then they rip it in half and give it to them and give it to them. And meanwhile, the queen's producing and other people are doing this. But eventually, as the population increases, everybody's bit is smaller and smaller because we're sharing the same number of playing cards amongst a larger population of bees. And this is why the bees then, the nurse bees then are triggered to rear baby queens, even though they have a queen in their colony, is because the queen pheromone is diluted by the larger population. Are we following me on that road? So this is a real trick. So the population increases and that pheromone decrease becomes the trigger to the nurse bees who are raising the new queens that will then replace the other one when the swarm is issued. And so then the last thing that's really that's really part of the swarm preparations is available laying space becomes scarce. And the reason that available laying space is becoming scarce is because the bees are filling up the brood nest area with food, pollen and nectar. Again, so many foragers are coming and dumping food into the brood area that the house bees can't get it out fast enough, which again is why I said adding honey supers and then adding brood space, you know, drawn comb right in the brood area slows this down because we're counteracting. It also, frankly, also helps with the queen pheromone dilution, because even though everybody's playing cards are smaller, if they're in a larger space, they can move around and not be as crowded and not stuck in a corner. Laura, yes, I see you have a question.
Yes, I'm just looking to understand. So why do they need drawn comb as opposed to if they just have foundation, but they need additional space? As long as they have nectar, can't they draw the comb and then use that space?
Yes, but what I'm saying is until they actually draw the comb, it isn't space. Do you know what I'm saying? So
Yes.
it's certainly better than nothing. But if you have a choice of adding drawn comb or adding foundation, I mean, I know that we all want our foundation drawn out, but if we're really focusing on preventing swarming, what we want is drawn comb. And so you can often, if you, so making those choices about what you want to use at any given time, in under what circumstances, the drawn comb is going to prevent the swarming or slow the swarming down better than
Okay.
foundation.
So if they swarm, they would still, and say they went and found like a tree cavity or something like that, they would still need to start from scratch there.
Correct,
Too.
correct. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit because that's really important towards the end of this. So
Okay.
yes, keep that, hold that in your head.
All right, thank you.
Yes. So let me just say one thing about that really quickly. Again, back to when the swarm issues. There is a bee researcher whose name is Juliana Rangel. It's spelled like Juliana, but she's from Colombia or something. So it's pronounced, Juliana, Rangel. And she has done the vast majority of her own personal research. She's at the University of Texas, I think Texas A&M actually. She has studied the actual activity of the swarming bees, how they choose, who decides who to do what. She's spent years and years researching and understanding that. So if you want to understand more about that specifically, that would be where to go for that information. But suffice to say that it's a very, very complicated process of the bees picking that swarm issuing. But one of the things that they do in fact do is engorge themselves on nectar, so much so that they basically can't stop but to be secreting tons of wax, because that's where the wax comes from, right? Wax secretions from the cells in the abdomen. I'm pointing at my abdomen segments here. And that's where the wax comes from. And so swarms are in fact fantastic at drawing comb. And when you do artificial swarming and manipulate a colony out of swarming, everybody who is planning on swarming also is great at drawing drawn comb. But that is kind of after the preparation stage, not in the trying to delay or prevent stage. It's when everybody's already geared up to go. So to try to prevent swarms without increasing the colonies, you can basically make sure there's plenty of storage space, reduce congestion. You can try the DeMarie method, which is a type of swarm prevention management. But the reality is 90% of all colonies will attempt reproductive swarming, and the 10% who don't are basically not healthy enough to do it. And so thinking about actually making increase is the most successful way of preventing swarming. And so again, back to the 3 components, removing which component is easiest to remove. The real key is if you just go take the queen and move a couple frames of brood with the queen, that will prevent the swarm. I'm going to talk about that a little more specifically in a minute. But so going back to the colony as it's getting ready to swarm. The vast majority of swarms in Maine will issue between like 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. And so I always like to tell people, if you come home from, and this is also the same time that the swarm will move from their temporary bivouac location to the selected nest site that they're doing, also typically between 10 and 2. So if you get home from work at 5:30 and you see a swarm hanging in the apple tree right in your bee yard, you do not generally need to give yourself shin splints running to get equipment and get that into the hive, fearing that they're going to fly away. Because at 5:30, they're probably settling for the night, which is not to say that you don't want to go get your stuff and get them in, because putting them in the evening will, before it gets dark, obviously, but will settle them in very nicely. But you don't have to freak out and panic. If you come to your bee yard at 11 o'clock in the morning and you see a bee swarm hanging in your apple tree, you better hustle and get your equipment, because they could move. They've still got 3 hours and they're in the process of looking for a place to go. So that's important. The swarm cluster that you find once the hive is swarmed is generally 25 feet or so from beehives, from the hive where they issued, which is not to say that I mean, I can't tell you how many swarms that I've found in weird places like downtown Portland. And I'm looking and going like, where could the parent colony possibly be that this hive of bees stuck on the side of a key bank, or the one that was literally on the Porteous Mitchell building at the mall, like on the side of Porteous. I mean, they must have come down from the roof. I don't know. But typically the swarm cluster is found near the parent. And then when they are choosing their nest site, this is also very important. Although they're clustering in the bivouac 25 feet or so from their colony, the location that they're trying to choose, they would prefer, all other things being equal, a quarter of a mile from the parent location. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can learn more about that. So here I am knocking a swarm of bees into a tub that I'm going to then take them home. There's 8 million ways to skin that cat. And we'll talk about a few of them. So once the swarm is up there in the tree bivouacking, what is happening is the bees and the queen are clustering together, and the vast majority of the bees are letting their temperature drop, and they are just chilling out to preserve energy and food, right? Scout bees are scouting for the new location. The scout bees come back to the swarm. They dance and do the whole voting thing on soliciting for their location. And then once that decision gets made, they move together, fly together, they warm up, and they fly together to the new nest site. That's the actual process that happens, kind of laid down into basics. So here's a picture of a bee removal that I did on Cushing's Island down here in Casco Bay. The bees swarmed on Labor Day weekend, and this following May, I removed this colony from the walls of the shed. And so often late swarms can in fact survive, but other times they end up in really unadvantageous places. And so, you know, one of the things about bees swarming is, you know, kind of why not just let them go off and swarm into the wider world? Well, particularly where I live, that can cause real neighbor relation problems. Also, like Laura was just saying, swarms, when you catch a swarm, they're fantastic at drawing comb. They're great starter colonies. They build, sorry for this typo on this, they build comb faster than any other type of starter colony, certainly faster than packages, also faster than nukes, frankly. And then why else to catch the swarms is to help the bees, because the less than 5% of colonies that swarm on their own survive to see their second winter, because they're in unsafe places and because their varroa loads aren't managed. And frankly, because there's a lot of other difficulties that face bee colonies these days. And so actually beekeepers tending the colonies have way better probability of survival. And so, you know, people say to me sometimes like, oh, I just let the swarms out. You know, I don't bother. I just hope that my hives requeen and I just let them go be in the natural world, which to me is like buying puppies and just not feeding them. I mean, it drives me bananas. Swarms that choose their own nest sites end up in really bad places. Here's a colony that was up on Cottage Road in South Portland over by Maxwell's farm, moved into this like stucco corner. And, you know, the homeowner, of course, wanted them out. So it's much better to actually give these guys a new home. And, you know, it's an optimistic act of nature, this reproductive behavior. And we beekeepers have skills and equipment to help them out. And so like, let's do that. And it's actually super, super fun. I mean, what's really interesting is, you know, the neighbors freak out. Like, you know, I mean, I'm sure everybody here has at some point seen or heard somebody be like, oh my God, I saw a bee swarm once. People are absolutely terrified. Everybody else is running away and beekeepers are running in super excited. We're all like, new puppies for us, you know. Anyway, so back to actually doing this swarming process. So when the bees at the parent colony are rearing lots of drones, rearing new baby queens, the queen is losing weight because of the congestion in the hive, which is making it more difficult for her to find places to lay eggs. So it's reducing her ability to lay eggs in the day. Then the swarm finally issues, and a third to half of the bees go out and do the bivouac. That's something crazy. I don't know what happened to my slide. I think what I was trying to show a picture of here, what you can see a little bit in the top, is capped drone cells and food in the brood nest area. This is congestion in the hive. Here's another good picture of like just lots and lots of food, nectar and pollen in the brood area. So let's talk a little bit about these new baby queens that are going to be leading up the parent colony. So the queen who has left with the swarm was the already mated queen. She's the queen you bought last year, or the queen that your hive raised last year. The queen in the parent is the one that that is new, and she is not inferior to commercially raised queens. Like there used to be this whole thing, if your hive swarms, that you should go out and buy a, find the queen that they raised on their own and replace her with a commercially raised queen, which is just absolutely crazy. The key to queen quality is nutrition. And the nutrition comes from the natural food that healthy colonies are deliberately rearing queens from. And frankly, the number of nurse bees that are feeding the eggs and larvae. And so swarm raised queens are probably some of the healthiest, best, most naturally raised queens that that you're gonna ever have. Much better than, for example, even queen rearing here in Portland, when I'm manipulating my colonies into rearing queens, I am in fact manipulating them. It's not because they feel like this is the right thing to do. And so although I can push them in ways that I want to get them to be rearing queens, it's not the same as them just having this abundance of food and the number of nurse bees who will attend those baby queens. So you often see the swarm cells down in the bottoms and the corners of the frames. These are the new baby queens being raised. And, you know, as a kind of like beekeeper 210, like once you get past just stopping swarming, using the queen cells that your swarming colonies are raising, deliberately breaking them out, splitting them up from the parent colony and using those to start your mating nukes is ideal. They are fantastic new baby queens. So again, this is another picture of a classic swarm cell. Here's another one over here on the other side. They're often near each other in the hive, or several frames kind of in the same area. Here's another picture of a bunch of queen cells being reared. Sometimes bees make jokes, including swarming onto posts like that. But so after the parent colony has swarmed, after the parent colony has swarmed, exactly what I just said, the new virgins emerge, and the parent colony is hoping that these new virgins are going to successfully mate and get back. And meanwhile, the swarm is out there hanging in an apple tree or doing wherever they are, being out there on that post. And it's a very risky time for both colonies. Like the parent colony may not get their virgin back. She might get eaten by a bird or a dragonfly, or just may not actually successfully navigate back to the hive. And the swarm cluster out there sitting on that post on the barbed wire, like rain, thunder, lots of things can happen that are really negative. And so you interjecting yourself into this process can definitely be very helpful to the survival of your colony. I add this picture to distinguish the difference between a supersedure cell and a swarm cell. This is a supersedure cell, and the reason I know that is it's on the face of a frame of brood that is approximately the same age as it is. And so indicate, like if I see this, I'm not, sometimes people just freak out. They see a queen cell and they're like, oh my God, my hive already swarmed. And we'll often go and kill this queen cell that's here, because they're just kind of on this panic. I got to reduce the queen cells down to 1. Then they look through the rest of the colony and they realize that was the only queen cell. And the reason was because the last time they were in their hive, the queen got lost or damaged. And so understanding the difference between a supersedure cell, which is typically on a big frame of brood, to the swarm cells, which are hanging down, they're in corners, they're in other places, is important to kind of try to learn those distinctions. Okay. So back to the parent colony. After your hive has swarmed, you get your hive, your swarmed hive, into the box, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Back at the parent, now we just want to be reducing the number of queen cells down to 1 or 2, preferably 1 if you're confident enough to do that. Lots of people have a hard time with that. But if you don't get it down to 1, they can still after swarm. And you don't have to kill those queen cells. As I said, you can use them in mating nukes. You can move them into other colonies. You can manipulate them. It's a great way to start your mating nukes. You also want to be very careful if you're inspecting the colony and some of the queen cells have already emerged, because new virgins are they're fluttery. They're not calm the way that mated queens are. And so you got to be careful moving the frames. And if they've already emerged, you kind of just got to like let it go and say, I hope they don't after swarm. I mean, occasionally you can get in there and actually catch the virgins when they're hatching. Get some cages ready and knock them into mating nukes, but you do need to be very careful with the new queens. And then once you've reduced the queen cells down to 1 or 2, just leave the colony alone for 3 weeks. Like, just let them go, let the whole mating process happen. You come back 3 weeks later and there's either going to be brood in there, and by brood I mean eggs and larvae, or there isn't going to be. But continuing to check, did the queen come back? Did the queen come back? Like, when it's too early is just more opportunities to squish her or get her to fly off in a panic. Much better to just wait until she's mated and back. So here's just a picture of a new landed virgin. She's very fuzzy. Virgin queens are their fur is still, their hair is just much more, it's less worn off, and you can kind of, their abdomens are smaller. Often their wings are kind of more outstretched. Laying queens, virgins look different because they haven't mated and they're not in that laying mode. So there's a little baby virgin right there. So this is back at the parent colony. Like I said, wanting to wait for 3 full weeks until you're looking for eggs. On day 20, we only have 2-day-old larvae, right? It's hard to see 2-day-old larvae in a very crowded hive that has been queenless for 3 weeks. They're going to be all full of food. If you wait until day 25, you should see at least a decent sized patch, the size of your palm, of cap brood. And so if you literally have the patience to just wait 25 days, come back and check and see if there's cap brood. And if there is, that's great. Everything's fine. And if there isn't, then we come back in with preferably a queen and some brood to get that colony kicked back. Here's another, just a queen returning to a hive from mating flights. Often you'll see queens doing, if you see bees doing kind of funny behaviors around your colonies, it's because we've got returning virgins. So once your queen is back and she's actually laying, then you can mark her and then you know how old she is. Here's another picture with a queen. You can see this one is kind of running away. That's, just more examples of getting used to looking for and finding queens. And so when you find eggs and brood, mark your queen then. Don't mark virgin queens because it just makes them more of a target. And also you don't want to mess up their flight muscles. When you find eggs and brood, if you feel like the colony has been queenless for a really long time and you want to beef them up with a frame of brood for another colony, that's great. It will increase their population. And then also once the queens are back, you want to add more super space, because while the queen was not laying, often the colony will just let the brood nest fill up with food, and then she comes back to lay, and they need a place to move that. So when you're going to check your colony to see if it's queen right, bring honey supers with you at that time. So the plan is, I'm planning to see my eggs and larvae, and at that point, I'm going to add the honey supers. Don't separate those two things into like two different trips, because it just means, one more thing that you may not actually do. Again, here's another virgin queen flying back to the hive, being weird on the outside of the hive, and also another virgin queen on the ground in my bee yard. Like, if you see bees being weird on the ground, you look at it, because often it will be something like this. This is probably another virgin from that might have after swarmed, who has now fallen and is on the ground and maybe is cold, and therefore isn't going to make it up into the swarm. And so this would be a perfect opportunity to pick this little baby up and shake a couple of cups of bees into a mating nuke, and see if you can get her mated and laying. Okay. Meanwhile, back at the bivouac. So when we install the bivouac into a hive, I always suggest installing the bivouac hive colony, even if it's in your own yard, on foundation, because A, they're totally ready to do it, and B, American foul brood. And I'll talk about that for a little bit more in a minute. If you have to hold the swarm, meaning like, I don't actually have a hive, I'm going to catch this swarm, and then I'm going to run to my bee supplier and buy a hive and buy some foundation. What you want to do is you want to put them in the basement. And when I used to work at Allagash Brewing Company, we worked in an open office, and everybody would hear me answering phone calls from beekeepers all the time, all spring long. And I swear to God, if you call anybody who worked with me at Allagash now and said, what should you do with bees? They'll all be like, put them in the basement. And because it's basically my answer to everything in terms of stabilizing colonies. And so if you catch, like I had that swarm that I caught in that big Rubbermaid tub, if I catch that swarm of bees and I just want to hold them until I can get the equipment ready, I take them, I put them in my cool, dark basement. And the key is cool and dark. The key isn't necessarily basement, but that's the cool, dark place that Mainers always have. The dark thing they'll just cluster. If it's cool and dark, they basically think it's nighttime. And so you can catch a swarm in your yard, put them in a box, put them in a cardboard box, put them in a Tupperware tub, something like that. And then literally set them in a cool, dark place. And they'll just be like, huh, boy, it got dark fast. Meanwhile, you run around getting all your stuff and then bring them out of the basement and install them into your equipment. If you, for example, just stuck that box of bees in your shed, right, that has windows and light and is warm, they will fling themselves against the windows trying to get out. They will not cluster and be calm. So that's the trick, is the cool, dark place. You can just hold a swarm in a box. Yeah. You could also maybe put them in a closet, as if it was, if you're single or you don't have any probability of getting divorced. But I definitely wouldn't just stick them in your closet as the better option. I would put them in the basement. So once you install your swarm hive onto your foundation, you want to feed them for at least a couple of weeks to help them build the comb. And the reason is, it's so much carbohydrate demand to do all the flying, to gather the food, to secrete the wax. Again, I'm pointing at my abdomen scales here. You want to feed them to let them get those carbs to build out to secrete the wax to build the nest. It's just, if the bees had money and could go to the grocery store and buy sugar water, they would do it. And so you're going to do that for them. Meanwhile, it takes a lot of pressure off the foragers, who can work on good quality nutrition, pollen for brood rearing, and because you're providing the cheap carbs. So just another cute swarm picture. There's a video on the YouTube. This one, Aaron Forbes, that's my old married name, catches a swarm that you can watch if you want to see the process of actually getting the bees out of the tree. It's not edited or anything. I literally was like, got a call from work. This is back when I used to work for Allagash. And somebody called and said, I've got a swarm in my yard. And so I went on up there and I basically just handed them my phone and was like, videotape me doing this. And I'm cracking myself up, but it's very cute. And there's this cute little kid. But so if you want to watch that, you can just Google it on the YouTube and you can watch swarm putting in. And there are a couple of other videos of package bee installation if you ever want to look at that, that exist as well. So again, catching the swarm, put it in the tub, stick them in the basement. So why did I say about the American foul brood? This is a really important subject that every beekeeper should understand. American foul brood is a bacterial disease of honeybees that is the bacteria causes the honeybee larvae to essentially disintegrate into a spore, a pile of spores of the same bacteria. And these spores have been like saved frames of American foul brood for over 80 years at the USDA lab. And they continue to test, like they take this 80-year-old spores out, put them in a bee colony. And in fact, those spores can be activated and cause American foul brood again. And it's really catastrophic in the bee industry. And it's literally why the Apiary Inspectors of America whole program was created, was to stop the spread of American foul brood and basically teach beekeepers how to prevent it. And so the problem is, if a colony dies from American foul brood in the fall or winter, like if it, or basically at any time, so now there's a dead bee colony somewhere in a tree or in a beehive. When your bivouac of bees in your home yard, which just emerged from your perfectly healthy colony, when your bivouac is up there scouting for a new home, if they go discover a dead hive from American foul brood and bring home nectar or honey from that hive, that will have these spores in it. Okay, are we following me there? The problem with this is, if you hive, so now they have, in the process of scouting for the home, picked up these spores. They haven't even moved into the hive with the spores. They've just scouted. They go find a little honey. They're like, heck yeah, I'm going to bring that home and dance about it. They come back, dance, let's go over there. They may or may not choose that, or you may hive them. But if they have those spores in their honey stomach, right, they've stolen the honey and they put it into an organ, right? A honey stomach is a different organ than a digestive stomach, okay? If you hive that swarm onto drawn comb, the first thing everybody who has stored food is going to do is regurgitate the stored food into the cells, because the cells are space and space is good for storing food, right? And so they regurgitate this bacterial spore infected honey into the cells and save it, because why? Bees are hoarders. And then they turn around and they go try to find some more, food to hoard. And then the queen starts laying, because she's a mated queen, right? She's already got eggs. I mean, she lands, she's ready for eggs. And she puts eggs in, they feed that infected bacteria to our larvae, who are the people who get infected by AFB. AFB infects bee larvae, not bee adults. And now we have an infected colony. And that colony is, then the larvae start deteriorating. They continue to feed it around, and the colony goes down for American foul brood. And you have the very unfortunate job of burning them alive, which is a drag. However, if you had installed that same swarm onto foundation, which is not space to regurgitate, foundation is nothingness that's going to take a few days to draw cells from, they will digest that infected honey. They will eat it. It will impact them zero. It will take a couple of days to get some cells for that queen to lay in. And the whole thing didn't cause AFB for anyone. And that is why in the natural world, where beehives are go into cavities, you know, we all know that beehives preferentially will move into cavities that have honeycomb in them. So wild colonies can get AFB in exactly this process because they accidentally move into a into a existing nest site that somebody else died, and they can move into that. But if they move into an empty cavity, they will not. And that's why AFB has not crashed the whole population of bees in the natural world, is because when they have to start from zero, they'll just digest that bacteria and it doesn't cause a problem. Is it anybody need me to clarify that anymore? I just want to make sure that it makes 100% sense. So that's the long way of saying hive swarms on foundation, even if they're in your own yard. And it's a great way to get foundation, you know, get new drawn comb into your operation. You know what I mean? Just put your swarms on foundation. It's just worth it to not take the risk. And then back to kind of the other thing about AFB, when Tony Jadzak, who was our previous bee inspector, who everybody loved, when he was first hired in 1986, 18% of all colonies that he inspected in Maine had American foul brood, which means that 1 in 5 old boxes of wooden ware, beekeeping equipment, has AFB spores in them. 1 in 5. And so that's the reason why we do not suggest using any old equipment unless it has live bees on it that have been inspected, because you don't know if it has spores or not, and you don't want to run the risk. Here's my bee swarm way up here. This is back when I was a little beginning beekeeper. And there was my beehive down there. There's my swarm. And so I don't have time, however, for weird time. I'm already at 15 minutes over. So I'm just going to do this super fast and say to you, swarm traps, when there's no way for me to get that, there was no way for me to get up there to get that swarm. And so the only thing that I could do is study swarm traps, which is basically putting bait hives so that the swarming cluster will choose your site. And Tom Seeley, who was at Cornell, he's now retired, has done his life's work of understanding how it is that the swarms choose their nest sites. You can watch videos of him talking about this. You can read his papers, but basically you want to get a cavity about the size of a single deep hive box with a 4-inch entrance or less. You want to get it up off the ground, 12 to 15 feet, 8 feet at minimum, and then put some swarm lures or attractants. You can buy commercial ones, or you can just buy lemongrass oil, which has some of the same chemical components as the Nasanov pheromone, and then set that out and hope that your swarm chooses your nest site. And there's a PDF that you can Google from Cornell. It's free. Bait hives for honeybees. It looks like this. That's what it looks like. And you can read all about how to build a good swarm trap. But this is a picture of a swarm trap in my home yard. Bees landing in it. This is literally made from an actual plant pot. You know, like bee suppliers sell swarm traps, but you can make them out of almost anything that you have. That's approximately the size of a, deep hive box, has a 4-inch entrance, is 12 to 15 feet off the ground, and has an attractant lure in it. And so this is made out of, I used to do a swarm workshop and we'd make them out of T111 because, we're Mainers. And there are the bees landing, and then they go in. You can see the duct tape here at the corner. The plant pot comes with 4 entrances. And so I would just duct tape up 3 of them and leave 1. I'm going to kind of just glance over this. Tom Seeley can teach you all of that in those, in his many publications and videos. But really the trick is, once bees have landed in your swarm trap, you want to move the swarm trap and get them into a beehive. And it's best to actually relocate that beehive 3 miles further from where they landed in the swarm trap, because the bees have now oriented to that swarm trap location. So even if you set them down below, they're going to want to fly back up to the 15 feet. And so I've got pictures of that swarm, this swarm here, which was that one that I showed you earlier, back when I was a little baby beekeeper. My very first effective swarm trap was a dog food box, which I ran around and did all these crazy things and, kind of came up with what I could come up with. And miraculously, they chose my box. It's very interesting because when you actually have swarm traps in your yard, you can see the bees scouting the trap before they move in. And you can see them even scouting multiple swarm traps. And that's actually a very important other thing to do, because if you put multiple equally attractive nest sites out for your swarm, it actually slows their ability to choose, because so many people think they're equally good. And so when I have swarm traps in my home yards, I always have a maximum of 2 swarm traps. I have a small swarm trap for small swarms who will select a nest site that's sized appropriately for them. And then I have a regular size swarm trap, which is about the size. So basically a nuke box swarm trap and then a full deep swarm trap. And that way, big swarms won't want to choose the little one, and they'll choose the bigger one. But it is very interesting watching them scout, and you can see that they're gathering energy to move to your swarm trap. It's very fun. So my primary swarm trap that I keep all the time is on a little balcony right outside my bedroom window. And so every morning when I'm brushing my teeth and getting dressed, I look at my swarm trap, and lo and behold, right around May 20th, I'll see people poking around looking at it. And I think to myself, one of my hives is going to swarm today. So anyway, once they fly all around, then they go in, and the next thing you know, 15 minutes later, it's like just a little few bees flying in and out. Like before, it was a Volkswagen bus of bees flying all over the yard, and they're super fun, easy, great way to catch your swarms. And so again, that's the plant pot one that I use often. And the choice, the way that the bees, when the bees move, it's super, super dramatic. But, once they're in, like this is them. Oh, I guess you can't really see it in this picture. The whole thing happened like, right down there. And, here's the Newfoundland and the German Shepherd's just absolutely fine. Don't even notice that the giant bee swarm just happened. So there is a swarm hotline for the Maine State Beekeepers Association. If you fill out the Google form or call 6194-BEE, it sends out an email to about 30 beekeepers all around the state, who then theoretically will respond to help. If you need a hand or need somebody to talk you through, you need to say where you are. But, in theory, if you call that phone number and say, my bees are swarmed here in my yard in Portland, and I don't have any equipment, I need someone to help me, several Portland area beekeepers will get that message in theory, and somebody will call you to help. I think that's all I've got to say about that. So I'm going to stop sharing and answer questions.
Erin, I have a quick one for you. You
Yeah.
mentioned a couple times, thank you very much for presenting, by the way. I know you covered a lot quickly. The mating nukes, I think, just correct me if I'm got this the wrong way, but the value of having that is you can potentially have additional queens that might successfully be mated. You've got the parent colony who you hopefully successfully mates, but you're sort of insurance banking these extra queens in case something happens with the parent colony. Is it sort of the logic there?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's so you can actually kind of back this up a little bit too. So if you think about when you look at colonies that have swarmed, they often have several different ages of queens. So they swarm when the oldest new baby queens are about to emerge or have emerged, right? That's when the prime swarm happens. But they'll often have queen cells that are, 5 or 6 days younger than the one that is emerging. And this is the bees doing that same thing, hoping that if the first round virgin doesn't come back, they're going to have a second round virgin who does. If the first round virgin successfully makes it back, the second round one is about to emerge, the first one is going to stab and kill her, right?
Yeah.
But they're doing they're doing this bet hedging. And so this is, again, us as beekeepers doing that same bet hedging. And frankly, so the super easy way to do it, if you had like a 2-frame mating nuke, right? So we're talking about a queen castle, or maybe even a 5-frame mating nuke with a follower board, or some little tiny box that you just manipulated. Take one extra. So now you've done your artificial swarm, or you're caught, your swarm is caught, and you go in and you inspect, you have all these frames. Just pick one big frame that has a queen cell on it, grab another frame of food and put them in the basement. Take those 2 things, put them in a mating nuke, stick that in the basement for 3 days. So the whole 3-day of night in the cold dark, and close them up with some screen, will cause the bees to basically reorient. And so you can take them back out of the basement 3 days later in the evening and not have everybody fly back to the parent, because they will then be connected to that new virgin that you're about to have, who may or may not have hatched during the 3 days in the basement, which is fine. And then put that mating nuke back out in your yard, and now your insurance call it. And it's almost no work. Like I just described the whole thing. It would take you 10 minutes.
Very
Yeah.
cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Who else? Are we really all the way there, or did everyone go and eat dinner?
Do you typically split and graft at the same time of year, or do you graft later?
I don't graft.
Oh, you don't graft, okay.
I don't graft. I do Miller method. Yeah, I only run. I mean, first of all, I'm trying to scale back. So, which I keep saying 12 to 25, like 12 to 25 is my goal. And somehow I managed to be around 50. And the problem with me is that I love queen cells like this, and I've got all this equipment. So why wouldn't I just throw them all in the mating nukes? But typically I don't run more than if I have 25 mating nukes going at one time, that's a lot. And when you graft, you're often making 25 on a bar. And I just don't, grafting is too many queen cells for me. I like to be, if I'm making queen cells and using them in my operation, I'm looking for like 6. So it's just not worth it to graft. I just do Miller and it's easier. Plus my eyesight is so bad now. It's ridiculous. I literally can't read the calories on a can of soup without my reading glasses on.
I'm
Old age.
I'm about to get my first bees, so I'm figuring that all this about swarming is likely not going to happen to me maybe till next spring.
Are you the person who said that you're getting your bees from Sparky?
No, I went to the Spicer Bee School and my bees are coming on May 18th.
Oh, they're a package.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. You likely will not have to worry about swarming.
Right.
At least not in the early season. There's a whole secondary reproductive swarming season, as I said, around Labor Day. And you may, if your colony is thriving, they may be thinking about it then. And that whole secondary swarming season is also laid out in that Bait Hives for Honeybee talk, because Tom has done a whole bunch of research on when the prime swarm seasons are. But for the spring reproductive swarming season, they won't do it. And the reason is the colony doesn't have enough brood. Remember I said it has to be queen, brood, and field force. Even though your package will be developing brood over the next couple of months, they won't have a big enough brood nest to be triggering that reproductive swarming instinct. They're basically too busy just trying to survive.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it'll buy you a little time.
Great.
Misha, I see. Hi.
Sorry, my baby's cranky in the back. I was going to ask if I should stop feeding my bees to slow down the process of potential swarming, or do I keep feeding, now that days have been rainy and
Are you feeding? So, tell me about your bees.
so I just went in for the first time on Sunday and they were out of food. They had minimal food. It's just one hive.
So they overwintered,
They overwintered, yeah.
but they're just light on food.
Yeah, they're late on food, and then they had a lot of eggs activity, which means that by what you just said is that they've started the process of swarming. There was a lot of drone comb buildup and also drone comb and empty in the bottom and full up top. So should I switch the boxes and stop feeding in order? Because my confusion is like, well, if I keep feeding, won't they, bring that down and then fill up more space, which I don't want that to happen.
Yeah, I would say stop feeding now. It made absolute sense to feed for the last week or so because, the highest probability of starvation is right before the food becomes abundant, which is basically right now. But the food is going to become abundant this weekend when it's sunny. And so, yeah, I would say go ahead and stop feeding. If they're really clustered towards the top and the bottom is actually empty, you can just do a straight reverse and put that empty space above them and they'll tend to move towards it. If they've partially moved down into the bottom box, I would just let them do that expansion on their own. So it's really, if the bottom box is totally empty, then yes, put it on top. But if they've kind of crested down into it, then just leave it.
It's not totally empty. I wouldn't say that it's totally empty.
Then I would say
There's just like a
stop
lot
feeding
of
and go ahead.
space and there's more eggs coming in.
Yes. And so really the trigger that you're looking for is capped drone brood and actual drone bees walking around all the way emerged. When that is happening, you should be looking for queen cells in your colony, but you've got a little bit of time. Yeah, but stop feeding now, which is not the same thing as you should have not been feeding at all, because we did need to, it was smart that you said, geez, they look light on food and this weather is too cold for flying and it's crappy and rainy. But now that things are going to turn nice, you can stop. And once the dandelions are on, dandelions don't come on when it's not warm enough to actually for the bee supply. So when you see full dandelion bloom, you can just say, oh, good, I don't have to worry about feeding again. Awesome. Awesome.
Rick at the Spicer Bee class talked about using this fork-like thing with points for drones. If Misha had all those drones, is that a time to stab the drone larva?
So the reason to stab the drone larva is to inspect for varroa mite loads, to actually look at the larva,
Yeah.
not just to get rid of the drones.
Okay.
Just killing drones, they just make new baby drones. I mean, it doesn't really do anything. But
Okay.
when you look at the drone brood, it's a good early indicator of what your varroa load looks like. Like if you can pull, I don't use a fork thing, I use a toothpick. But if you can pull 20 or 25 drones that are just starting to get their eyes, basically, big white larvae, and you can, if you don't see varroa mites on 20 or 25, that's pretty good. If you pull drones and if you pull 10 drones and you see 3 with varroa on them, you want to think about maybe doing an early spring treatment. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's kind of a different subject, but
Would you do what kind of treatment would you do now in the spring, early spring? And early spring, you mean like next week or?
well, first of all, I don't see a lot of high levels in my operation in the spring. So I don't immediately think that I need to treat in the spring. But if I were going to treat, like if I saw high levels right now, I would use Hop Guard. And the reason is it is non-disruptive to the queen rearing process, which is what the bees are naturally wanting to do at this time of year. It also can be used when honey supers are on. It also has no temperature restrictions. So it is, in my experience, quite effective and easy to use. You don't need a lot of protective equipment. So yeah, HopGuard would be my go-to now. In the fall, my go-to is Apolife Var, but that can be very disruptive. It's very smelly. It's because it's menthol and eucalyptus oil. And so that could be disruptive to the queen rearing process. You also can't use it when the honey supers are on. So for spring, you want to stay, you could do HopGuard, you could also do Formic, but I don't like Formic because you need all kinds of, protective equipment. It's dangerous to people and bees.
Well,
Cool.
Erin, I want to thank you again for such a great information-packed presentation. It was nice getting that perspective on swarms, and I've taken lots of notes, and I'm about to go download Tom Seeley's paper on his research in catching swarms. So
Yeah.
thank you again. I'll say let's say goodnight to everybody, and we'll see you all soon enough.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks for all doing all your good work with your bees. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.